In this lesson, we're going to be looking at caustics. And this is the phenomenon that happens when light passes through a clear refractive material and it bends and magnifies and projects these bright squiggly lines in the shadow of the material. And when it comes to bodies of water, we typically see this most often in a pool setting, because the clearer the medium, the more pronounced the caustic effect is. Now, when it comes to computer graphics, this is something that takes a long time to calculate. And with physically correct renderers like cycles, a proper result is very dependent on lighting. And in my experience, the lights and the caustics don't always match up. So here I want to show you a brilliant way to cheat caustics so that they render much faster, and we have artistic control over the final visual result, mostly regardless of the lighting conditions. I've actually covered this technique already using wine glasses. You're more than welcome to check out that additional training content. And I do need to credit Bassam Kurdali, because to my knowledge, he's the person who came up with this technique. So now let's jump into Blender and implement it. First thing I'll do is organize my nodes a little bit better. Let's grab this top cluster, move it away from these others, and with them selected, using the Node Wrangler add-on, I'm going to choose Frame Selected. And then I will rename this to be Refraction. Copy that and paste it to the label as well. There we go. Now this is a little more organized visually. And I'm going to splice in my fake caustic effect in between my refractions and reflection elements. Now the basic structure of this trick uses the transparent BSDF and a couple geometry input attributes. So we'll start off with an input geometry node. And then we'll follow that with a converter vector math node. And then after that, we'll set up a color ramp. And that will be plugged into a transparent BSDF. But to actually test this visually and isolate the caustic effect by itself, I'm going to duplicate the transparent BSDF and then mix the two together, mix shader. And we'll put the top one in the upper socket, bottom one in the lower socket. And now to connect up these geometry, vector math, and color ramp nodes, I'm going to take the normal socket of the geometry, plug it into the upper vector socket, and then the incoming into the lower vector socket, and change the operation to dot product. Now this value can be plugged into the factor for our color ramp, and the color ramp can be plugged into the transparent BSDF, the lower transparent BSDF. And then for the factor of this mixed shader, we're going to take the shadow ray, shadow ray socket from the light path node, and we're going to plug that into the factor. Now what this does is, for the shadows of our material, we will use the transparent BSDF right here on the bottom. And then for everything else, like what the camera sees, diffuse rays, glossy rays, and everything else in this list, it will use this upper transparent BSDF, which renders nothing. So if I hit Shift-Z in the viewport now, I haven't actually plugged in this mix shader of the transparent BSDF, so we're still seeing the overall ocean shader as it exists now. And if I zoom in, we can't really see too much caustic effect happening. For example, in the symbol of the CG Cookie logo with the eyes and the mouth, even though the geometry is thin and most clear, we don't see definitive caustics happening. So let's first plug in this transparent BSDF, this upper one by itself. And now we don't see anything. We don't see any shadows, any reflections, anything at all. It just kind of disappeared. However, when we look at the mix of both transparents together, now we start to see kind of a representation of our geometry only in the shadows. Remember, we're just using the shadow ray light path, because ultimately this is where we see caustics appear. But it really doesn't look like caustics yet. We need to adjust our color ramp really any way we like, as long as the effect is appealing. So I'm going to switch our interpolation to ease, and then I'm going to drag up the dark flag significantly higher, and then add a few more flags. What I want is 2 bars of white. So let's make this new flag black, and then move the white flag in between, and then add 2 more flags. One will make black, move that one all the way to the end, and then another one will make white. and move that in between the last two blacks. So here we have 2 bars of white. And in my testing, I find that this gives kind of the caustic result that I like. But it's still very dark and it looks like a shadow. So in order to make that kind of magnified, similar to caustics, or rather the magnification of the light through the medium, I'm going to add a converter math node after the color ramp. And we'll simply multiply this by, let's say, 2. And now when we look at the effect, remember this is just caustics by itself, it's starting to look like caustics, similar to the way that it looked in our reference image. Granted, this is not physically accurate, it's extremely artistic, but if you ask me, this makes a pretty convincing caustic effect. And the fact that we can adjust this however we want, that's really quite appealing, in my opinion. So at this point, I'm satisfied with the way the caustics look by themselves. Let's now implement them into our overall ocean shader. We can cut the connection of the transparent BSDF, the upper transparent BSDF, and now we'll plug in the shader output from our refraction nodes, plug that into the upper socket of the mix shader, and then connect that into our reflections. So here we have the combined effect, and it doesn't look too bad, at least in certain spots, but as we look at the whole shader totem, it does start to get a little weird on the upper half, where we can definitely see that really cool caustic effect happening. We've kind of lost the color information from the absorption effect. So with this caustics trick, the shader totem isn't really the ideal object for testing the effect. So to easily turn this on and off, I'm going to add a converter math node. We're going to plug it in between the light path node and the factor for this mix shader. And the is shadow ray light path will go into the upper socket. I'll change the operation to multiply, value to 1, and then the output into the factor. Okay, at a value of 1, it's on completely. At a value of 0, it's gone. So that's an easy toggle. And now to further test the caustic effect, I'm going to demonstrate through a pool example. So I'm going to save my file and then open up pool.blend and immediately go to File, Append, and let's grab from the file I just saved, which was record04. We'll go to Material and Ocean Material. I'll go ahead and assign it to our geometry, our pool geometry here. And something important about the way the scene is set up, you'll notice that the pool geometry is shrink wrapped to the pool deck. Because remember, the shader is dependent on the depth or the thickness of the geometry. So if I just threw a plane in here and lined it up to the surface of the water, the shader would not work. So to take advantage of that absorption, I've modeled the geometry to be a little more physically correct. Though in the shrink wrap modifier options, if I scroll down, I do have a negative offset so that it pushes the geometry outside of the pool deck. Hopefully you can kind of see what I mean. We have a little bit of intersection over here, but that's not really too big of a deal. All right, now back to the shader. Let's go ahead and hit Shift-Z in the bottom right viewport to see what we have. And right away that looks nothing like it did on the shader totem. So this is where the scale is important. The scale of this pool scene is very different from the shader totem object. So I'll switch over to the node editor. And let's see, make sure my water object is selected because that's where I applied the shader. And since our pool is kind of glowing over there, I'm going to go ahead and turn off our caustic effect. And okay, yeah, so that's clearly not calibrated correctly, at least for the scale of this scene. So I'm going to focus on just the refractions for now. And let's start dialing this down. Let's cut it in half to 5. How about 1? Okay, so we need to go way down. Okay, there we go. If you see in the viewport as I hold shift and drag right and left, you'll see the gradient kind of pop in. So it's a really sensitive number. Let's see if I can type in like 0.04. Okay, yeah, that's starting to look a little bit better. Where what I'm trying to do is have the deeper end of the pool maintain that darker color, and then towards the steps as the water gets more and more shallow, I want the color to fade to perfectly clear. So how about 0.03? I think I like 0.04 the best. And then for the color of the deep end, since this is a pool, hopefully your pool is never this color, so we're going to want to switch that to a much brighter bluish green. Let's drag that value way up. There we go. That's starting to look like a pool. Maybe a little more towards the blue end. No, I think I like it right about there. And let's take the saturation way up. Okay, that's pretty good. And now let's take a look at the caustics again to see what the issue is there. Re-enable it from 0 to 1. And we don't see an effect because I need to plug this mix shader into the output. And there we go, clearly a problem. So to troubleshoot this, I'm going to swap out the refraction mix shader node with this transparent BSDF so we can just look at the caustics. And when I do that, we can see that it's shining pretty bright, so maybe my multiplier is too high. Yeah, that helps to tone it down, but also I wonder if the scale of my displacement or the multiplier of my displacement strength is too low. Let's try stepping that up to a value of 1. Refresh the viewport because remember the geometry needs to update. And there we go. I can, if I look closely, I can start to see a little more geometry affecting that caustic trick. To test this a little further, at least the level of displacement, I can plug in the glossy BSDF. And here we can see that the geometry is displacing, whereas if I take this down to 0.1, refresh the viewport, there's no effect there. So let's increase this to 1.5. Yeah, I think that's a pretty good value. Let's see, my wave structure is okay, but I think I'm going to take my finest detail level down here at the bottom, and where I have the X value scaled to 0.3, let's go ahead and bump that back up to 1 so there isn't that skewing. There we go, that's not too bad. And now let's see if I can't dial in the caustic effect by itself. If I zoom in, we can see a little bit of the effect working out, but you know, it's not the right pattern. It doesn't look like that magnified squiggly line pattern that we saw in this reference image. So I'm going to try and tweak our color ramp to match that a little better. I'll go ahead and delete these 3 flags because I don't think I'll need them for this example. And then kind of the trick is to figure out where the hot spot is. For example, if I move the white flag down, it starts to get darker. So clearly the middle of this ramp is not where this caustic information is. It's, what about all the way up? No, it starts to get darker all the way up as well. So it appears that right above the 0 in this position value, that seems to be the hot spot. So now let's drag my lower flag up to be really close. There we go. Now we're starting to dial in where the caustics are most appealing. Okay, now let's drag the upper flag down. And yeah, I think that looks pretty good actually. But the strength isn't strong enough in my opinion, so let's bump that value back up to 2. And really this is where I can dial in the value with the rest of my shader. So let's grab the refraction BSDF and replace this testing transparent. And then perhaps I'll do a render of this. Okay, yeah, that's looking pretty good. The water's fairly dark though. So maybe if I switch the interpolation mode of the ramp, let's give that a shot. Right now it's set to ease. What if I change that to linear? And I think that might help with the caustic shape. Yeah, it's looking better in the preview, but still it's pretty dark around the steps. So maybe I need to increase this value right here from 1.5. Let's try 2. And that definitely brightens up the entire pool. What about changing my scale to, let's go 0.035. I don't really see any difference there. How about 0.02? And we can start to see the greenish color start to shrink back towards the most extreme depth of our water object. So 0.02 is a little too far. 0.03 I think I'll be happy with. I wonder if I darken this blue color, if that'll help. Well, no, not quite. I think I liked it better bright. So maybe I should increase this value to try 3. And now the water's starting to kind of glow and emanate a little too much. So I think 2 is a good value. That's worthy of a render at least for comparison. There we go. That's looking pretty nice. Let's compare it to the previous one. Yeah, switching to the linear interpolation mode for the ramp definitely helped that caustic effect. And I think that's fairly convincing. So at this point, I'll do one more render because we haven't included the reflections in any of our tests. So let's Shift Control click on that and then look at the preview to see if we notice the reflections. And yeah, you can start to see them a little bit, but maybe 0.7 is a little too low for the Fresnel fall off value. So let's bump that up to 1 and do what is hopefully the final render. Okay, let's take a look at before reflections and now after reflections. Yeah, that final reflective element reveals more of the wave structure and really completes the water feel of the material. So that is going to be all for the caustics element of this shader.